This holiday season, surprise everyone on your list with the best gifts. Tickets to see their favorite artists live. Choose from thousands of concerts and comedy shows, including Mariah Carey, Mary J. Blige, Matt Matthews, Metallica, Thomas Rhett, Trans-Siberian Orchestra, Sarah Silverman, and so many more. Share a memory together, or give a gift they'll never forget. Find the most exciting gift for every fan at livenation.com/gifts. That's livenation.com/gifts.
In January of 2022, Deputy Abigail Bieber of the Hillsborough County, Florida Sheriff's Office went away for a long weekend with her boyfriend, Detective Dan Leyden, who worked for the same agency. What happened would put a spotlight on the issues of officer-involved domestic violence and, for Abby's family, lead to a mission to stop this from happening to anyone else. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to Crimelines. This episode is a little different from the cases I usually cover, but it's probably one of the most important ones I will have covered this entire year from the standpoint of change and advocacy within our system. I want to start by thanking Bruce Bieber, Abigail Bieber's father, for speaking to me about not just his daughter's case, but about the broader issues. In addition to my interview with Bruce, the Rising Beyond podcast had a great interview with him that I will leave linked in my sources. He's also done a few more podcasts since we spoke, which include the We Need More of This and the Killer Psychologist podcasts. I will also leave those linked below. Let's get started by talking about Abigail Bieber, who was born in March of 1991 in Washington, D.C. She grew up in the area with her parents, Bruce and Sarah, as well as two older brothers, Ben and Daniel. Abby attended the University of Maryland, and in 2016, she moved down to Florida. In 2018, she joined the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office and started where most people start, as a patrol deputy. Abby's goal was to eventually work her way up to being a detective with the Criminal Investigations Division. The Hillsborough County CID has 5 sections, and Abby knew where she wanted to work within that, and that was in the Special Victims section, primarily helping children who were victims of abuse. Those were the calls as a patrol deputy that really stuck with her, and it's where she knew she was making a difference. Abby also wanted to help other female deputies who were trying to make it in a predominantly male field. I think cop shows sometimes touch on issues of gender and policing, but it'll be a single plot point in one episode, and that's the only exposure most of us get to it. No one really knows what it's like unless they're there. Most women who work in law enforcement work as civilian employees. As of 2023, nearly 60% of civilian law enforcement employees were women, working jobs like dispatch, records management, victims advocates, assistants who do general office duties, and so on. When it comes to working as a sworn deputy or officer, it's around 13% that are female, and that's the national average. It can be as high as 22% in Louisiana or as low as 3% like in West Virginia. The Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office, where Abby Bieber worked, is about 17% female if we include both law enforcement and detention. Abby knew that as a woman, she had to work harder to prove herself as capable as her male counterparts. So when she saw a female rookie stumble or struggle, she would pull them aside quietly to give them advice and even correction if it was needed. She wasn't told or even asked to do this. She just stepped up and did it. She wanted to help them as much as she could. And it wasn't just the rookies who liked her. A lieutenant Abby worked under said that she had the respect of all of her supervisors, and people wanted her on their shifts because of how good of a deputy she was. And that's echoed by everyone who has spoken about her. Multiple people have said that she was their go-to deputy if they needed something. Not only was she dependable, but she was fun to be around and to work with. Do you have a coworker who is both reliable and someone you enjoy being around? You know how important they are in any job. Abby was that person for the people she worked with. As Abby settled into her career in law enforcement in Florida, her brothers were doing likewise. One of her brothers, Ben, served a combat deployment in Afghanistan and then went into law enforcement, and it wasn't long before their other brother, Daniel, joined them in Florida. He was actually the first of the three to go into law enforcement, having served 5 years as a patrol officer in Montgomery County, Maryland, before he moved to Florida and joined the local police department. By the time Daniel had moved to Florida, he already had 12 years of public service experience as a first responder. We're talking he was an EMT, a firefighter, and then a police officer. Bruce and Sarah raised 3 children who all went into public service, which I find incredible. By 2021, Bruce and Sarah had all 3 of their children living in the Clearwater area, so it's really no surprise that when they retired, they left the DC area to go join their kids and grandkids in Florida. Around the time they moved to Florida, so late spring 2021, Abby started dating someone she met at work, Dan Leyden. He was originally from Toms River, New Jersey. He had recently started working as a detective with the Gunfire Response Investigations Team, but had been a patrol deputy prior to that. Bruce told me that Dan was charming, intelligent, funny, thoughtful, and just seemed like a really nice guy. He showed attention to Abby's family, buying them thoughtful gifts, and on paper, he seemed almost too good to be true. And Abby saw that side of him too, but for Abby, it was a little too much. As she told her mom, she felt like Dan was taking the relationship far more seriously than she was. And by that, I mean he was looking to a future together while Abby was still getting to know him. She didn't want to plan a dinner date a month in advance yet, but he seemed to have a whole wedding dreamed up in his head. I think it's good to note right here that this is one of the only clues we have early on in a relationship to know when we are being love-bombed versus just loved. And that's the problem, right? Love bombing looks a lot like love, particularly early on when you're in a bit of a honeymoon period, where things do feel intense. I went and looked up the differences between love bombing and love because I genuinely didn't know how to tell them apart in situations like this. I usually hear about it in the abuse cycle where the love bombing comes after there has been an instance of abuse. But when we're looking at a brand new relationship, how can we tell when someone is being loving to us versus love bombing us? And according to licensed marriage and family therapist Taya Stone, that intense love that moves way too fast, that is the warning sign you should be looking for. Love bombing is a manipulation tactic to get you to form a connection very quickly, one where you are willing to do what the other person wants and you'll stay with them no matter what. And Abby may not have put it in those exact words, but she definitely saw the red flag that this was. Instead of falling in love with this perfect on paper guy, she kept hitting the brakes. The relationship has even been described as on again, off again because of how often she would need space from Dan and his intensity. After about 7 or 8 months of this back and forth, with Dan still running 7 steps ahead of her, Abby told her mom that it was just about time she called things off for good. It just wasn't working out. But before she broke up with him, Abby and some other friends had planned a trip to St. Augustine, which is on the eastern coast of Florida. Abby did not want Dan to come on this trip. He either missed or just as likely ignored her hints about that, and he went anyway. It was initially conceived as a couple's trip with 2 other deputies who were dating, and then a 3rd male deputy and his civilian wife. They went the last weekend in January 2022. With Abby really ready to break up with Dan, I think this trip only confirmed to her that things weren't working out, and according to the others that were sharing the beach house with them, Abby was sleeping on the couch in the common area rather than in a bedroom with Dan. On Saturday, January 29th, on this trip, it was clear that things were not going well between Abby and Dan. At some point that day, Dan lured Abby into his bedroom. The others in the house heard raised voices, and at one point in this argument, they heard Abby say, "Put the gun down." Dan did not put the gun down. Instead, he opened fire, shooting 30-year-old Abigail Bieber 3 times in the head. The others in the house hid in a closet while they called 911. They were actually in the closet for nearly 2 full hours. Initially, Abby's family had been told that the other deputies were not armed, which explains why they sheltered in place. But then Abby's family got a copy of the 911 call and learned that, contrary to what they were told, at least one of the deputies did have his firearm on him in the closet. It is not clear why they didn't try to intervene at this point, other than fear. The St. Johns County Sheriff's Office responded to this 911 call as an active shooter situation. A neighbor who lived next door told the media that he and his family were told to stay inside and stay away from the windows, but like a lot of us would do, he peeked out anyway, and he saw that they were evacuating a few people from the 2nd floor of that house. The 3 Hillsborough County deputies and the civilian that was with them had insisted that the only way they were leaving the house was by ladder from the bedroom window. So the St. John's deputies had to arrange for a ladder from the local fire department to come to the house to get them out. And that might be part of why they were holed up in the closet for so long. The neighbor heard the responding officers calling into the house and ordering someone to come out with his hands over his head. But Dan did not come out. When the police finally made entry, they found that after shooting Abby, 31-year-old Daniel Leyden had turned the gun on himself. According to the neighbor, the scene was considered secure around 1:30 in the morning. And then, before 3 a.m., deputies showed up at the doorstep of Bruce and Sarah, Abby's parents, to make the death notification. These are parents who had a son in combat and currently had 3 children in law enforcement. For about a decade, this exact scenario was their nightmare. They were informed that their daughter had been killed, but not in the line of duty. Rather, it was at the hand of a man they had welcomed into their home and into their lives. Days after Abby's death on February 2nd, the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office arranged a motorcade that would drive from their side of the state over to St. Augustine, where they would then bring Abby's body back for her funeral in Clearwater. Her brothers were joining in the procession, and Bruce and Sarah went out early in the morning to see them and the other officers off as they left. Of course, they would be there when they returned. The media aired the video of this, and they published some very heart-wrenching photos of this very somber day. What they didn't air, though, was something that happened right after the motorcade left in the early morning hours. After they drove off, a deputy approached Bruce, and what he said changed Bruce's entire understanding of what had happened to Abby. He told Bruce that 6 years earlier, he had responded to a domestic violence call where Dan Leyden was the perpetrator. Bruce was absolutely floored. He didn't know Dan to be abusive towards Abby, and he certainly didn't know there was a documented history of it with anyone else. He didn't want to tell Sarah right away because this day was already hard enough, and there were still some hard days ahead, like planning the funeral. So instead, Bruce texted the information to himself, including the name of the deputy who had talked to him. And this was a smart thing to do. Never rely on your memory in moments of grief. I remember a few years ago when I lost someone very close to me. I got mad at a family member for not telling me something, but then when I went back through our text messages, she absolutely told it to me. It's like my brain hit the maximum number of things it could process and just refused to absorb anything new. So it's really smart to write down important things whenever you're going through a period of intense stress, like when you're grieving. It was a few days after this procession that Bruce was confronted with Dan Leyden's past again when his son came to him to tell him that he had heard there was a video that had been posted online. It was about Dan, and it had been posted the same day the motorcade had crossed the state. Bruce got on the internet, found the video, and then he shared it with his sons. This video was posted on Instagram by a woman named China Ratner who had dated Dan Leyden. I am going to leave the direct link to her video in my sources so that you can check it out because I think it's important to hear directly from her what happened. China is a social media marketer today and she has a platform, but her relationship with Dan started back in late 2015 when she was 21 years old and she was involved in a very bad car wreck. Deputy Leyden was on the scene, though it's not entirely clear whether he was one of the responding deputies or if he showed up on his own. At the scene, China remembered Dan amongst all the other officers because he was just so nice. He gave her his jacket and he stayed with her, helping comfort her in the aftermath of this wreck, which included the loss of her dog. He took down her phone number under the pretense of checking on her later, and he did call a couple of times before he sent her a Facebook message in December of 2015 asking her out on a date. There are some pretty obvious ethical considerations when it comes to a police officer using information he got at a crash site to ask someone out. It seems there is a pretty automatic power imbalance from the start when she's essentially the victim and he's an officer. 911 calls are not meant to be a dating service, and in many departments, this is explicitly against the rules. I will note that Abby also met Dan while on a call, but they had more equal footing as they were both deputies working for the same agency. Anyway, back to China, getting this Facebook message. She remembered Dan was caring and so nice, and she agreed to go out with him. Much like with Abby, Dan moved quickly, wanting to spend all of his time with China. Or rather, he wanted all of China's time to be spent with him. China was only 21 at the time, and she did not see it at first. She thought they were just so passionate about each other, so of course they wanted to be together. It wasn't until later that she realized how little time she was spending with family and with friends, and even doing things like going to the gym became an issue because wouldn't she rather spend that time with Dan? For a guy like Dan Leyden, a 21-year-old who recently had a traumatic experience was the type of person he could just bulldoze over. And I think China, who was used to being a strong and independent person, didn't realize how vulnerable she was in that moment. In a period of months, Dan had China so isolated that her life was pretty much going to work and being with him. You can hear more details of what this looked like in her video. And that brings us to the domestic violence call that Bruce had been told about. It was July 3rd, 2016, and China really wanted to go out to a party with her friends. Dan agreed to let her go, but he gave her a time she needed to be back by. Yes, so from January to July, that is how much control Dan had over China's life. She had to ask permission to leave and was given a curfew on when to be back. While China was out, Dan called her 17 times, in part because she was late getting home. When she pulled in around 1:30 in the morning, he was waiting for her and he was irate. She hadn't even gotten out of the car when he started yelling at her, so China decided not to get out of her car. At this point, there had already been instances of physical violence, and she knew opening that door was not safe. But Dan only got angrier that she wouldn't open the door, and he started punching her car window. China just wanted to leave, but Dan warned her that he was putting his foot under her tire. If she backed out and tried to leave, she would have to run over his foot, and then she would be charged with battery on a law enforcement officer. So, China backed up anyway. Now, this was not a moment of anger or I'll show you, but more panic over the feeling of being trapped and in danger. And then it was followed by shock. Dan called the sheriff's office, as in his own fellow deputies, to the scene to report the assault on him. The power imbalance here is so obvious. Not only was Dan a cop, he worked for the very department that was responding to the scene. The police report says that China was reluctant to talk to them when they got there, which I'm sure she was. She was in the losing position. It wasn't until they told her that Dan was talking about pressing charges against her because she ran over his foot that she told them her side of the story. She told them that Dan was refusing to let her leave, that he had a pattern of being controlling in the relationship, and that she was scared of him. To this, Dan said he only tried to stop her from leaving because she was drunk and in no shape to drive. One of the deputies noted that both China and Dan smelled of alcohol, and Dan had glassy eyes. But he noted that China did not appear drunk, so she was not given a sobriety test, and neither was Dan. This is where I paused and first thought about how much Dan being a police officer was entering into their thinking. I mean, Dan asserted he was trying to stop her from driving drunk, which would have meant she drove drunk to get home. But if they tested her using the smell of alcohol as probable cause, they would have to test Dan too. So did they really think no one was drunk at the scene, or did they just not want to test a fellow officer? It's worth noting that when Dan left the scene, he left in an Uber. Was that his choice, or did the deputies insist he not drive? And that's right, he left the scene in an Uber and not in the backseat of a cop car. The resolution to this call was to make Dan leave and tell China to go ahead to her apartment. And before the deputies left, they handed China a victims' rights pamphlet. This incident was sent to be reviewed by a detective and an assistant state attorney who looked at the options in front of them. If China had run over Dan's foot, it could be an aggravated battery. But if she did it because he was not allowing her to leave, then maybe he should be charged with false imprisonment. Bruce noted something that I missed, and that's that it doesn't look like anyone considered filing any domestic violence charges. In the end, they decided to charge neither of them, concluding that there was no evidence any crime was committed. And because no charges were laid, it did not trigger any type of administrative/internal affairs investigation. The sheriff's office, when asked about this after China's video came out, told ABC affiliate WFTS News that China never filed a complaint against Dan Leyden, which was another way an investigation would have been conducted. But why would China file a complaint? She told the police face to face what Dan did to her, and they gave her a pamphlet. What would a formal complaint do other than rile up her abuser, who she was trying to get away from? The relationship did end shortly after this incident, and Dan reached out to China while she was at work, saying that he still had belongings at her apartment that he wanted back. She told him she would go ahead and drop everything off with him that evening as soon as she got off of work, but she told him explicitly not to go to her apartment. But Dan did not listen, and along with a friend, he broke into her home. China knows this because she had already installed a camera in her living room, in part to document any abuse and harassment from Dan. She could see on this recording that Dan and this other man who was also a cop went through and got his things. And then Dan got on China's computer and started messing around on it. When she got home, she realized he had deleted her written timeline of the abuse in their relationship, as well as photos she had documenting physical marks. From then on, Dan would harass her. He would call her, blocking his number from caller ID. He would drive by. He would create new Instagram accounts to message her from. And on her video, she shows her block list. He didn't hide that these accounts were him and they were variations on his name. He just would not leave her alone. Then one night, China was out when she bumped into Dan. He ended up following her home where she had gone with a friend, and that friend was male, and though he was not China's boyfriend, Dan didn't know that. Afraid for his safety, China told her friend to leave. Dan then followed her into her apartment, yelling and acting erratically. Needing to go get help, China made an excuse about having to go walk her dogs, and as she was about to leash them up, Dan pulled out his gun, put it to her head, and told her that if she screamed or drew any attention while she was out, he would kill her dogs, her, and then himself, in that order. Again, I think it's important that you hear the words from her, so I'm going to let her tell all the details in her video that I recommend everyone watch. But basically, Dan spent the night abusing her. When he left in the morning, China did not call the police. At that point, why would she? And she just wanted him to leave her alone. So instead, she talked to her dad about setting up more security at her apartment, cameras inside and out. And after this incident, Dan only called her a few more times, and she says in her video that she doesn't know why he seemed to mostly move on. But my guess is that he started dating someone new. In the weeks and months after China's video went up on Instagram, 8 women reached out to her with stories of their own abusive relationships with Dan Leyden. Dan's official record with the sheriff's department does not reflect his private life. There was only one citizen complaint against him in his file from the 8 years he was with the sheriff's office, and it was a woman accusing him of screaming profanities at her when he responded to a call. The complaint apparently didn't meet the bar to trigger an investigation, so it just sat there, much like China feared her own complaint would have done. The only other thing of note was that he was apparently not a good driver, as he was in 2 crashes that were deemed avoidable, but otherwise his file is certificates of commendation.
This holiday season, surprise everyone on your list with the best gifts. Tickets to see their favorite artists live. Choose from thousands of concerts and comedy shows, including Mariah Carey, Mary J. Blige, Matt Matthews, Metallica, Thomas Rhett, Trans-Siberian Orchestra, Sarah Silverman, and so many more. Share a memory together, or give a gift they'll never forget. Find the most exciting gift for every fan at livenation.com/gifts. That's livenation.com/gifts.
The Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office did respond to China's accusations. With it being so public and with their own image-conscious leadership, it's not surprising that they said something. But from what China and Bruce have said, what they ended up doing was a surface-level investigation at best. Bruce did try to get the results of the investigation through a records request, and Florida famously has the most transparent laws when we're talking about sunshine laws. But Bruce was told there was no documentation. So he was verbally told they were investigating, and their own public information officer put out a statement saying that they opened an investigation, but Bruce couldn't get any information on it. It seems like there is a view within the sheriff's office that even if Dan did abuse China, there was nothing they could do about it because he was dead. But for China and Abby's family, their hope was that an investigation would expose any gaps in the current policy and procedure for how officer-involved domestic violence calls are handled. Officer-involved domestic violence is a bit of an arm's-length phrase because it doesn't identify the actual issue. It's not that an officer was involved, but rather that the officer was the perpetrator. So while the industry phrase for it right now is OIDV, some are pushing to move to PPDV, Police Perpetrated Domestic Violence. For this episode, I will be using them interchangeably. Mark Wynn is a law enforcement consultant who specializes in domestic violence generally and OIDV in particular. He has long advocated for departments to push harder in cases when there are accusations of domestic violence, even if no charges are ultimately filed. This would include taking their gun and requiring a psychological evaluation, neither of which happened to Dan Leyden. Unfortunately, Abby's father, Bruce, worries that the Hillsborough County Sheriff, Chad Chronister, is just too focused on public image to delve into the real issue of officer-involved or police-perpetrated domestic violence within his ranks. You may recognize that name, Chad Chronister, because he has recently been in the national news. He was briefly Donald Trump's pick to head up the Drug Enforcement Administration. Days after the announcement, Chronister withdrew his name from consideration, but then Trump came out and said that it was actually him who dropped Chronister because it turned out Chronister had enforced COVID-19 lockdown laws on a church. I'm not trying to be political here, but pulling a nomination for a law enforcement position because the person enforced the law is weird. How about we pull it because he sticks his head in the sand when it comes to serious issues within his own office? Now just Google 3 words for me: DEA, agents, and scandal. And you will see why we need someone to head up the DEA who knows how to keep his own stoop clean. Anyway, Sheriff Chronister has said repeatedly that they offer mental health help to deputies and he encourages them all to use it. But what that tells me is that he doesn't really understand what happened here. People like Dan Leyden, people with a repeated pattern of control and abuse in relationships, are not going to take a vague offer of talking to a counselor. One of the reasons people like him are difficult to treat is because they don't believe they are the one with the problem to begin with. Dan Leyden was not going to stop until he faced consequences for what he was doing. And they had the opportunity to do that in 2016 when they suspected there was abuse in his relationship with China. They could have taken his gun and ordered a psychological evaluation. And back in 2016, Chronister wasn't even the sheriff. So at this point, he could blame the whole thing on the last guy and then get brownie points for doing better by enacting better policies. But the Bieber family feels like the sheriff just wants Abby's murder pushed out of the public eye because it makes his office look bad. An example Bruce told me was when the office had a break room dedicated to Abby's memory, which included displaying some of her personal effects in cubbies. The sheriff's office planned to unveil the newly designed Abigail Bieber break room at their annual Christmas party, which the sheriff was going to attend. The Bieber family was also invited, but they did not go because, honestly, the merging of a somber memorial unveiling with a holiday party was just not something they were comfortable with. Instead, they visited quietly just a few days before so that they could see it. Later, after a Tampa Bay Times article came out on Abby's case, with the Bieber family expressing criticism of how the department handled OIDV, the sheriff's office contacted the Biebers to let them know that the break room was an unauthorized change, and they were basically just going to take it apart. If this break room was unauthorized, why didn't the sheriff say something when he was invited to the unveiling? And let's say he, for some reason, didn't know about it. Why go to the time and effort to undo something that was already done? I hate to break it to him, but boxing up Abby's personal effects will not make her legacy go away. Abby's family would not have to be publicly critical if they weren't hitting a brick wall with the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office, and if they hadn't learned how widespread this issue of ignoring OIDV is. Bruce has been networking with other advocates like Mark Wynn, and he learned that a huge problem was getting departments to accept that this was even an issue. It's not that law enforcement leadership doesn't think OIDV occurs. It just doesn't occur in their department and with their officers. Or if it does, it doesn't happen often enough to necessitate its own policy above and beyond a typical domestic violence call. And it is hard to convince them otherwise because we don't have hard numbers on OIDV since it is not tracked or reported separately from any other domestic violence call. We do have some academic studies indicating that domestic violence does happen with police officers more than in the general public, but we don't have the really hard data for each law enforcement agency. So Bruce decided the way to convince people that this is happening where they live would be to find cases within the last 2 years in each state. All he used was a spreadsheet and the Google search bar. With the exception of sparsely populated states like North Dakota, he found a number of cases in every state within the last 2 years. And those were just the ones that were reported to the police and that the media picked up. The problem wasn't finding cases, it was deciding which one to include for each state. Bruce now has the information to say, yes, this happens here. But then we encounter another issue with it. The reason law enforcement could say it didn't happen in their department was not always true ignorance. Too often, it was willful ignorance. You're not going to find what you don't look for. It is a harsh reality, but domestic violence is seen as a lesser crime. Let's say Dan Leyden went into a parking lot, banged on a stranger's window, screamed at them, and refused to let them leave. When the officers arrived at the scene, his eyes were glassy and he smelled like booze. Would the police have put him in an Uber and sent him home? Would they have given the victim a pamphlet with no follow-up? Probably not. They would have at least investigated. They may have even arrested him at the scene. But when he did all of those same things to China, a woman he was in a relationship with, they decided no crime was committed. It is almost overwhelming to think of how big of an issue this is, and it is going to take more than policy changes to fix it. It will take a societal shift in how we think of domestic violence, but that doesn't mean there isn't anything we can do while that very slow process continues to happen. When it comes specifically to police-perpetrated domestic violence, the good news is no one has to reinvent the wheel. Not only did the International Association of Chiefs of Police create a model policy on OIDV in 1999 that was later revised in 2003, Florida State University has also developed an OIDV model policy and training program. It was used in Florida for years. Because it was linked to a university, of course they did follow-up research, and they found that it worked. There was a greater reporting of officers involved in domestic violence incidents when law enforcement was trained on it. This program was funded through Verizon, which does a lot of work in domestic violence-related causes. If you have ever seen the documentary Telling Amy's Story, which you can watch on YouTube, the Verizon Foundation funded that production. But unfortunately, when the Verizon funding ran out for the FSU program, no one else picked it up, even though they had proven results. So that's what's needed. They need someone to fund the updating of the training and then implement it. Even if it is just one module in the larger domestic violence training law enforcement should be getting anyway, it would make a difference. Honestly, I think the funding should come from the government. Law enforcement needing to find outside funding to cover training sounds ridiculous to me. It is literally what we pay taxes for. Maybe the state of Florida needs to take a look at their budget and find that funding. I mean, I have suggestions of where they could find it, but I would actually have to get political to get into that, so I'll just say that I believe in my heart that they have the money should they choose to allocate it to this cause. As we know from other cases, these types of movements spread, like the Amber Alert system named for Amber Hagerman, or Kaylee's Law that makes it a crime not to report children missing, named for Kaylee Anthony, and Katie's Law that expands DNA collection when people are arrested for felonies, named for Katie Sepich. It starts in one state, and then other states start adopting the laws because the work is done. The model is created. It's so much easier once one state develops something for the others to copy and paste. And in this case, Florida doesn't even have to start from scratch. They still have the old model policy and the training program. So that is what Bruce Bieber is working on now. He's working with the state legislature to get this policy and this training available for law enforcement agencies in Florida. And then, when that's in place, he can start moving out to the other states. To get this going, the public needs to first agree that this is an issue, which is why I spent all of this time going over it. I hope I sold you on the issue if you weren't already on board. Now, the second thing we need to do is pressure politicians to care about it. This will best come from Florida residents currently. Send an email to your state reps. Tell them that you've learned that FSU developed a training program for law enforcement to combat officer-involved domestic violence. You want them to support any efforts towards getting that program back in action. The lives of Florida citizens are on the line. As Bruce Bieber's LinkedIn profile says, he gets out of bed to keep some other dad from having to bury his daughter. The least we could do is add our voice to his chorus.